I'm from Ontario, from Toronto, and I lived in Montreal, so I can't acknowledge all the territories, but I do want to acknowledge that pretty much my entire life and everything that I do has been on someone else's ancestral territory, and in New Brunswick, there's a major land claim going on right now, which is kind of interesting because they never ceded their land. There were no treaties, and yet five families have basically run this province for the last almost 400 years, so or 300 years. So I do want to acknowledge that, and I do have a lot of Indigenous partners, and I do a lot of work with Indigenous groups. So I'm grateful that for that relationship. Okay. All right. So I call this constellations of possibility because really I envision the especially with the current discourses on helping people with complex care needs, high acuity needs, especially in my field so far, uh, people experiencing homelessness and having high acuity. People tend to think that there are simple solutions, and they tend to want to characterize their decision to help based on these notions of deserving and undeserving character, as if those of us who have had problems are undeserving in some way, usually runs against their narrative, conventional narratives. And what they don't really understand is that you can't ask people to make choices without the the institutional, social, and personal supports in place to make choices that make sense. So that to me, it's when I look at my own life, and I've written a lot about it. I'm actually writing a memoir about it because it's quite my life is quite bizarre. It's not quite very. It's really not normal, but I'm looking at how these certain things aligned, and I get really angry. I like I said, I've been in recovery, and I'm abstinent, but it's not the kind of that's not the only form of recovery I believe in because the conditions that led to my particular story, I don't think really exist for people anymore. So we'll talk a little bit about that. So just so you get it, in 70s, I didn't know this, and I'll explain it to you later. I didn't know why I was so into getting high. I was an athlete. I didn't smoke cigarettes. Uh, I liked acting out. When I was 16 or so, started 15, it was the 70s, started smoking. I actually bought a bag of oregano once, thinking it was pot. It's one of those cliche stories, but I didn't know that it was because of the fact that my father was beating me at home. I didn't know that that's what it was. We didn't really have those discussions, right? And just so you know, we ended up through the recovery process becoming best friends again. So I'll explain that. So in 77, we started, like everyone else, we started drinking and smoking dope and mostly hash in Toronto, and it felt really good. And then I realized some years later in therapy that, see, I had drowned when I was 9 at a time when I was getting slapped around quite a bit. And this is going to sound, this is part of my, was part of my, sorry, my ongoing mental health issues. I didn't know what it was, but there was this thing in my head that feeling good and feeling good right away was amazing because in our house, you kind of learned to worry and then you got hit if you did things badly. And it was very inconsistent. And so I tried to chase the feeling that I had when I was drowning, which was not terrifying, by the way. It was first of all, it was the late 60s. Nobody really had a vision of what that's like. That wasn't part of it wasn't on TV shows. It wasn't something that we didn't talk about this stuff. So it's kind of strange. Anyway, so I found out later that that's one of the reasons why some people make it very complicated why they get attached to addictions. But the self-medicating part of it is partly social and partly pharmacological. It felt good, so I don't know. Anyway, it became progressive, and by the 80s, when I went to university and got out on my own, I was you know, doing it every day, and pretty much everybody was. It was kind of strange. And by 82, when I started teaching and TAing, I was doing a lot of coke and all the other stuff that goes along with it. And drinking, all my professors drank. We would meet at the faculty. It was part of that culture. And also, I should tell you that on my mother's side of the family, my parents divorced when I was a kid, when I was 5. My mother's side of the family, was a very well-known artist. Her husband is still alive. He's a very well-known writer, and their friends were people like I'm not going to name drop, but a lot of very famous Canadian artists and all these people. So when I was attracted to their side of the life, they supported my artistic career. I've always been an artist as well as an academic, and they were all really cool people. And partying hard was part of that culture. So there was this cultural support thing going on, and and this is going to sound strange, but it's important when we try to understand the kinds of choices people might make on how they deal with mental health. First of all, people in that culture sort of frowned on psychiatric interventions or psychology. In fact, as writers, they all had troubles that they turned, as writers and painters, they all turned that kind of angst or whatever that issue was into expressive forms. It was quite brilliant. And And I know some of you have read some of the books or watched the films or TV series that some of their friends, based on their works. It's all very troubled, dark stuff, but that they had that ability to work it out. And not only that, when you were wasted and talking till 4 in the morning, that seemed normal to them, and it made it very normal to me. So there was, on the one hand, this push towards excessive use of substances, and that kind of condoned it. And then one day, actually, this is a true story. A very famous writer who wrote a film called Barfly was at a wake for my stepfather's father, and I was drinking with him. And he looked at me after like 3 hours, and I was very troubled. I was about to leave school, which happened in '87. And it's partly result because he looked at me and he said, Eric, you're a Hunter S. Thompson type. I hope you guys know who Hunter S. Thompson is. He said, you're a Hunter S. Thompson type. You don't need to worry so much. You're a Hunter S. Thompson type, and you should go with that. And so I literally took that as I didn't know who the person was until later. They all explained who this writer was, and because I really not, I lived in those shadows, but I wasn't one of the trees. Anyway, I kind of took that to heart, and I did, and I ended up leaving school, moving into my gallery, started selling drugs, drinking, selling all kinds of dealing, basically. Opened a couple of clubs in Toronto, and by 19, I have to move this, sorry. By 1988, so we're talking literally 5 years between the time I started getting heavy. I was on welfare, evicted from where I had lived. I was doing some murals. I was drinking about 40 ounces of liquor. I laugh because it's shocking to me when I think about it. And I was into everything. I didn't use needles, which is why I'm still alive, because I'm afraid of needles. But I did a lot of drugs that today are consumed through IV. So I'll move on just a little bit here. So my bottom, 1990, I left my PhD again. Sorry, I came back to do my PhD after my gallery failed, stuck it out for 3 months, just couldn't stop getting incredibly wasted. I was paranoid, I was uptight, I want to believe, and years later I had a discussion with a psychologist that was developing or was a borderline personality, but he said no. Anyway, I was 128 pounds. I had lost so I have no septum, and I'd lost all the bone in the top of my teeth. My only calories were coming from alcohol. I was totally paranoid. A friend of mine was murdered, a young woman. It's a very famous case in Toronto, and I wrote a script. I was still writing. And I wrote a short script about it, and it drove me into this place of absolute darkness. I was so paranoid and so worried. I'd gone from this place of when I ran my bars in Toronto, we were like my girlfriend and I were like the kings of Queen Street. It was crazy, and I was doing really well at school and everything, and I had my art and everything was great. And within 5 years, I was at a bottom that they talk about and people don't believe exists. And I was lying in bed waiting to die, hoping that these dealers that I owed money to, honestly, I was suicidal but not capable of doing it. And I owned one possession. I owned a futon that I found on the street, and I was about to be evicted again. So I had a studio that welfare was paying for, but I wasn't paying my rent, so they were going to evict me. And so I was waiting, left my doors open, knowing that this weird stuff was going on all around me. And my sister found me, and she was in the film business, knew some physicians, and was able to get me to a doctor, which is what started the constellation of events that led to the work I do now. Sounds strange, but it's true. So that me on the is me on. Can you see this? That's me on the left. That's 84, happy as heck, getting high every day, having a good time. No one believed I had a problem because I was doing so well. But there I was. And then on the right, that's me 4 years later, completely useless, yellow. But you can see it in my eyes. My teeth are. It's a very quick and rapacious disease. And in that world, in my family's world, that was something they didn't see because I think they all were affected in some way. Anyway, so 95, my friend is murdered. I'm waiting for people to die. My sister finds me. She gets me to a doctor. I go to treatment. And I don't know if you guys know much about the difference between treatment and rehab, but at least in those days, we had 28-day treatment periods where you go for the first time and you detox and you learn a little bit about. I went to an abstinence-based program. And so I was there for 28 days. I probably needed like 2 years, but I didn't want to stay. So I managed to convince them that yeah, I get it. I have a disease and I'm not going to drink or use. But that summer, I didn't do the things they told me to do, which was, and I got involved with people and places that I shouldn't have got involved in. And I had a really serious relapse. One of the reasons I'm against carceral rehabilitation or forced rehabilitation is that when people are forced to do these things, even if it's for 2 to 3 months, if they don't want to do it and they come out and they relapse, people don't understand how violent relapse is. You don't start off slowly. You go back to where you were after having not been there for months, and people die from it. And I nearly died again. So I called my doctor, and he said, I told him I was having a relapse. And this is why I talk about a constellation of events. Back in 1996, 95 in Ontario, you could get the government to pay for very long-term rehab. Back in that time period, there was people were aware of issues like this, and there was definitely this deserving, undeserving binary out there about who deserved care. But if you were willing to get care under certain conditions, they would help you out. So welfare paid for what they call ODSP in long-term disability in Ontario paid. I could go for up to 2 years to this one place that they found for me. And I had called my doctor, and he said, "Listen, I knew you were having a relapse. I haven't heard from you. I reserved a place for you for January 1st, 1996." And I did. So that's my dry date, 12:10 a.m., January 1st, 1996. And they got me into treatment for 14 days, and then they got me to rehab. And the rehab program I went to was for 24 months. It had a relapse prevention program. It had therapists on site. We had group sessions. We got involved in recovery, which was very important to me, community engagement, and working with people like ourselves. It was really, really amazing. It focused on mental health, it focused on our social lives, and it focused on not none of the CBT and DBT didn't exist back then, but in the relapse prevention program, we learned about triggers, we learned about, poor behaviors, we look back at our histories guided through so we need to have trained personnel to guide us through these things in clinical situations. And also, one of the problems I have with the way people, yeah, especially youth with mental health, are treated today is that they go into, say, a youth shelter or a youth program and they get DBT or CBT for like 3 weeks, and then they're left on their own. And those are long-term programs. All you can do is stir up a great deal of problems for individuals by starting them on this therapeutic road and then dropping them. So the other thing that this treatment center offered was aftercare and all kinds of supports. And at that time, they all did, at least in Ontario. So I'll move on. So this is the constellation of events that led to my ability to reinvent myself. I had an actual bottom, two really, but the last one I had was inescapable. It proved that I didn't have another uh, uh, I couldn't go out again. I couldn't use again. I was going to die. And then it made me realize that I had problems that the using was just a symptom of. So then there was intervention by my family. She got me back in to see her doctor again. They supported me. I had a family, despite all the problems I caused, who supported me. I had access to health care, which is so difficult to get right now. So I had a primary physician and every ancillary physician that I needed to get to. I saw the only difficulty, and this is something I should share with you because of what you do. I went to see a psychiatrist who was, before all this really started, I went to see a psychiatrist who was an addiction specialist, apparently. I told him my life story, some of the things I'm telling you in the light version. And he looked at me, and this really sent me off. This was in 1991. He said, Eric, your problems are too vast for psychiatry. And I walked out of that office, and I remember calling my sister and saying, I have no idea what to do. I literally had no idea what to do. And I had degrees. I came from a good background. I was literate. I had business. I mean, and I still ended up in that place of mental and spiritual nadir of despair. So when I left the rehab, I also had an aftercare plan, and I had people in place to help me do it. They helped me set it up. And here's the real important thing for me. I could get housing. I got a studio in Cabbagetown for $300, a nice, beautiful studio in a cool house. If I didn't have, I found housing on my own because I was making a living again as an artist, but there was all kinds of supports for people then. The market had not closed at all. In fact, condos were being built everywhere. So you could actually rent an apartment cheaply because they were all vacant. Having training and work was really important. And then the most important thing that we're going to talk about is working with the folks I was meeting on the streets. I immediately started meeting people on the streets who had gone through what I was going through, and I continued writing. I was writing in rehab about losing home, about mental health, about this entire reinvention of the self. And so there were thousands of people in Toronto for the first time on the streets. And they took me one day to this little place called Tent City in Toronto. And I started doing films with them and interviewing them. And we did this for 10 years, and you're going to see a version of that in a minute. So basically, in rehab, I learned that my addictions were related to the abuse by my father and that I needed to have that dealt with. So I started uh, continuing the therapy I had done then. I got involved with a couple psychologists and psychiatrists eventually. I used antidepressants to help me guide me through that material that was going to be turned up. I understood that this need for instant gratification was largely related to things that had happened in my early childhood. Sometimes we call these ACEs. I think you all know what ACEs means, adverse childhood experiences. Um, I also felt really bad for a long time being an addict, but when I went to rehab, everyone there, everyone who worked there, everybody was an addict. And it's the same story. I had a young guy call me the other night, and I told him to stop being so hard on himself. I said, first of all, we're very interesting people. And I also said, don't be hard on yourself because you think about your mental health problems or you think about using. That's who we are, but it doesn't mean you can't, it, that has no, it doesn't mean you can't be a successful and interesting person. So it's something that a lot of the youth deal with, the idea that even if they're not painted with it, they feel this generalized other labeling them. And so we self-label as bad. If we hear, usually when we're not feeling well mentally, or if we're um, worried about our so-called people seeing us as deviant, when we hear somebody refer to us as a deviant, I don't like that word. Especially back then, we really took it to heart. Like, what is wrong with us? And when your role models and your parents early in life have mistreated you, your mother abandons you, your father beats you, when that kind of stuff happens, these are not wounds that you can deal with easily. Today, we talk about them openly. Nobody talked about that stuff in the 70s, and it didn't start until the end of the 80s. So one of the cool things was I began to see myself through others in rehab. And I'll tell you very intimately what happened was I lost all my teeth. So I had to go to Toronto to get this. I had an abscess. And when I got there, they removed all of these teeth. And that's when I realized I had a no bone. And one of the things that I'd always made fun of with people who were drunks and alcoholics was that they had no teeth. And a lot of the guys at the rehab who hated me to begin with, they all had dentures, and they all hated me because there's this kid from Toronto. I'm Jewish too. There was no Jewish people, and they were all there for remedial diversion or other legal reasons. I was there because I really had to be there. So there were all these things that went on. It was interpersonal conflict. And learning to manage that actually was one of the parts of being there. But I got there, and this is true. Sunday night, I got home. Monday morning, I'm there trying to figure out how to clean my denture properly. And there's a big sink, there's four sinks, and two of the guys were guys who hated me, and they saw me struggling with my teeth, and they walked over and they showed me how to clean my teeth properly, and they gave me a lesson on dentures, and it was like, I know this sounds stupid, you guys, but it's what made me realize that we're all like in that world, we're all in it together. And it changed my life. Like I sometimes tell people that that was my spiritual awakening. Okay, so that's the root of my soul. This is how I get my ability to see things through other people's eyes, right? So having gone through the system helps me understand the system on different sides and I do a lot of work with social workers. I helped design the social work program here. I did just finished a 4-year study on frontline workers in Canada and PTSD and burnout as a result of COVID, which is kind of a cool study. All of these experiences I had were really interesting, but what was most important was working with the guys from Tent City. So making these films and did this documentary called Subtext Real Stories, and there was an exhibition at the Royal Ontario Museum on Tent City. I don't know if you guys, is anybody familiar with Tent City in Toronto? Do you know what it was? So you know that at the beginning it was 6 shacks, and at the end there were 115, almost 150 people living there, and it was violently what's the word? Everybody was violently evicted after 3 years, and they were given rent supplements. So they ended up getting like their protest and their visibility led to what we now call housing first. Really, it led to the first uh, supportive housing in Canada, really. I mean, on that scale. So my buddies that I had met down there, we had made this film, and we followed each other for I don't know, it was almost 10 years, some of them. And that film got picked up for this exhibition, and that really helped me. I had been applying to universities because I really wanted to write about this stuff I was going through, and no university would take me. I got interviews. I had the dean of York University tell me they'll never let me in. They'll put me on their short list, but they can't make sense of my lived experience. Like they can't, there's no way for them to rationalize it. And then Concordia's had a program for lived experience. So you guys may be familiar since you're in Montreal about the individualized programs at Concordia. They called it SIP. It's an amazing program for people who are coming back or coming to school through alternative routes. And I showed them the film and they said, "You're exactly what we're looking for. Come on over." And so I did. This is an excerpt from the film. I want to show you a little bit about it. Can you hear it if when I play it? Okay, so let me move the screen. This is okay, this is a 4-minute version of what the work looks like. And this stuff was done, it started very early on. It started in 2000 and it ends in 2013, just before Brian died. But it shows you how this relationship that occurs in lived experience research transforms. It's really, the longer versions I'll give you the links to are really interesting, I think. I was caught in the storm, far away, far away, far away, far away. Don't let... This is some of the most valuable real estate in North America. And despite a continuing problem with homelessness in Toronto, development along the lakeshore continues at an unprecedented rate. And it stops here, a 24-acre plot of toxic landfill, where until a couple of years ago, a community of squatters had built a shanty town known as Tent City. After their eviction in 2002, nothing remains of Tent City except the stories of these rugged and often troubled people who now adjust to life in mainstream housing.
Yeah, said you're going to do a studio for making films.
Yeah, another one.
On the waterfront where we are. There's going to be, it's going to cost you 150 million and employ 2,500 people. So I won't get a job. Not even a spare taker. No, I used to cause a lot of problems. What did you do? Anything and everything. I sneak in through your window. You open that much and I'm coming in while you're sleeping. And I'm rattling your pockets. I kidnapped the police in Ottawa.
What?
I had them all chasing me. I had one cop beside me here, right here, driving. As you get on that phone, you tell him back off. No, see, or family jewels are going.
You remember our last interview, last 17 interviews?
Oh, yeah.
You never mentioned any of this.
Oh, no. I keep a lot to myself. I got out, he says, put your gun on top of the car. I says, I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll put my gun there. You take that gun out from your boot and put it up there. And one cop stuck his head up. That's how I knew there's another cop there. I never knew. He's, ha, you can't fool this guy. And then with his hand down like that. Now I know where they all hide. They had us. You know, if we made a move, we're gone.
What were you doing?
I robbed this year bar. Because I've changed. I don't know if I changed for the good, but the worst. It's unbelievable.
What is it?
So complex. Look at the fields. You don't see this uptown, do you? That's sugar and that does. Look at the grounds. That is the Moss Park.
What's your last memory of downtown?
Walking out of it. Walking out of it. Coming here. Coming here. I had two daughters. They're dead now, though.
What happened to it?
They got burnt in the fire. My wife was home crack cocaine. Place got caught in the fire. Like because of the fire and that, you know, I just moved out of apartment that I was scared of fire, right?
And being in apartments?
Yeah, I didn't want it no more.
Or so? You remember that, Brian?
Yeah.
What did you tell me about? That's when you were working at the factory? Tell me. When you look at that, how does that make you feel? When you look at that,
To see me on there?
well, not just to see that you.
Well, it's you know, it's some memories are I like to just forget, right? You know, I'm moving on. I'm like entering the church. I'm the same way, and same reject for all the years they've been stuck with me and to be hard times. I recommend. Welcome the three newest members of the Salvation Army.
You know, you didn't talk about God in about 9 years until about this year.
Okay.
How come?
I'm never had a peace.
Talk a little louder.
Huh?
Can you speak up a bit?
Never had peace of mind then. My mind was not at rest.
And how did your mind come to be at rest?
Through God. Through God, yeah. She said that that's it. That's it. I just want to relax myself and enjoy myself. And I'm enjoying myself.
So that's Brian. Now, I show it. I hope you all can hear that all right. So Brian and three of the other guys at Tent City were all members of the Kingston Penitentiary when we had the very famous Kingston riots. And it was a very important. I teach courses on anti-criminology, and I show them that element of the film in my class. So they were there at a time when prisoners were raping younger prisoners and guards were endorsing it. And there's a certain code amongst these guys. And so Brian, Terry, and Eddie were there. And Eddie, who's a big part of the original film, is the reason we had the Kingston riots. He was protective of a young guy, and the guards would not deal with his rapist. So Eddie killed him, stabbed him 17 times, and they segregated Eddie, gave him an additional 17 years, and the prison went crazy. So it's a matter of history. There's a couple documentaries on it. It was just ironic and fortunate in a weird way to find them all living in the same community, Tent City, in Toronto's Tent City, which, by the way, was never tents. It was buildings that they built out of scrap. Um, and we all got to know each other really well, and they all had experienced these incredible traumas that started when they were kids, when they were young children. In fact, Eddie and Terry had spent, Terry was 52 when he did the film. Eddie was, I think, 57. They had spent over 35 years of their lives in juvenile detention or prison. And so outside of that, they didn't even have any normal social life. There was no socialization, no family unit. And so a lot of youth who are coming from very disrupted, this is something that was really important to me. It still are coming from very disrupted, especially um, uh, unstable family units and are leaving and might have some kind of forensic involvement. Um, the dangers of that kind of thing happening are very high. So this is something we're looking at these days, and I'm sure you are as well. We're more concerned about prevention than intervention. But even with people who had been and I'll say it this way because we all knew we worked together for years because we all recognized how damaged we all were. And we laughed about it because we understood. Like we could joke about the things that happened with us, not because they were funny, but because it's like, damn, it's just so common and people don't know it. So we'd all experienced trauma from our significant others. We all had certain issues, and they wanted their stories told. So I'll send you the link to the film. I hopefully you'll be able to watch the original documentary. But one of the things that it showed me was once they got housing, it's amazing what happens when you give somebody guaranteed housing, when they know they have a place to live permanently. They even if they can't it has nothing to do with addictions. But if you want people to get over addictions, for example, or substance use, there's no way they're getting over it without housing. And even so, we're talking about three folks who represented, in my opinion, in terms of consumption and mental health issues, their mental health issues were more profound than mine, but their addiction levels were the same as mine. We were worst case scenarios when it came to substance use, and even they were able to modify or eliminate their substance use if they wanted to when they got housing, and they were able to have a place to confront the things going on in their lives and to reflect. Housing is like a ball. It is like a medicine, and there is no healthcare without housing. So that's from that moment on, that's been the that's been the um, the process that I've taken in my life. But one of the things that was really important, that's the film, the long film that got me into my dissertation, which looked at Dignity Village, which was the first one in North American history to be legally contracted by a city. And we'll look at that in just a second. But I started thinking and writing a lot about how do you do ethical visual representations of such problematic lived experience? Like, and don't forget, that's 2009, so it's 15 years ago. Now we do it more freely, and there's so many platforms out there now that people are using, and it's to me, it really bothers me. It's just I'm not on a lot of them because it's very unethical the way people represent people in marginal and vulnerable positions. So for me, is like the things I was able to do when I made that film, I was able to do because I wasn't at school. But the films I've made since are much more guarded because of the responsibilities imposed properly on us by the Tri-Council. So I started looking at the ethics of representation, and these were important books. This is an amazing book for if you're doing lived experience studies. It's called The Ethnographic Self, which is about it's a collection of stories about individuals um, talking about their own memories and experiences, and the fact that when we're doing any kind of research in our own worlds, we're doing a form of autoethnography, which is writing ourselves are present. We can't pretend that they're not, which is one of the real fallacies of early anthropology and participant observation. Another is by Catherine Church, who some of you may know. She was the leader of disability studies at Ryerson. She's also in a she's retired now, but she's also a mental health advocate. And in Forbidden Narrative, she talks about how working with individuals who had mental health, psychiatric diagnoses, she had her own psychiatric episode and had to explain how that impacted her work with them. That's an amazing book. I recommend it to all my students. And the other one is called Time in the Other, which is by an anthropologist, which helps us understand that whenever we're working with people in lived experience, we have to lived experience scholarship requires looking at people, places, communities, groups, however we're looking at them in terms of their own sense of time and speed, and that we don't impose. We have to be aware when we're imposing our expectations, especially about cause and effect. Like if they talk about something that happened and they say, so I got hit by my partner hit me. So, I went to the other room, and what some people, and I've seen people do this, they'll go, well, why didn't you just leave? And that is a really judgmental statement to say to somebody who's the subject of abuse. And yet students in social work do that all the time. So you have to learn how to have that conversation. Maybe you can't even ask that question for a couple of months till you get to know someone better. But this is a really interesting, it was one of the first books that helped anthropologists and ethnographers of all kinds understand their responsibility. Oh, yeah, I'm in the wrong. So that's important stuff. So autoethnography, whenever we're working with people with lived experience of mental health or um, or addictions, and they're in our own world, we have to understand how our biases are very present. And so it includes a very strong reflexive piece. And I encourage my students, I do a lived experience scholarship class, and I in my anti-crim classes, when we write about our attitudes towards certain forms of so-called deviance, I ask students to check themselves. Let's figure out where you're coming from before you try to pretend that you're looking at this in a scientific way. The other thing that I do in most of my work is, though, I write really sort of turgidly for my own purposes, very theoretical, very scholarly. I believe in public ethnography, and when you're doing visual work, one of the things is that it's a public facing methodology. And so when you're presenting people visually, there's a lot of risks in place. So one of the things that I do is I always include the people I'm working with in making the films and editing the films and telling their stories. Everybody, that's why with Brian, that was one of the experiments of how there's a longer version of that film too, where we look back at all these key moments that happened on film for 13 years. And he goes, oh my God, I didn't say that. I didn't mean that. And so I give people a chance because film literally is a chronological history in order. It literally captures things in sequence, and you can go back and change people's stories. And I think when we're using lived experience and people are being this open, even if we're doing interviews or surveys, we have to offer people an opportunity to revisit. And if we're talking to the public, we don't want to use big words. We want to make sure people understand what we're saying. We want to provide a textual bridge so that people can go, so that things can resonate with them. So that when we're talking about harm reduction, or we're talking about opioid deaths, that the distance is reduced. And using fancy language and scientific terms and jargon is a bad way of doing that. So this is the work I did in Dignity. I have time, right? I'll try and wrap it up quickly. There's not that many left. So I did go to Dignity Village, thinking it was the greatest place on earth because that's how they had represented themselves. And when I got there, I found that in fact this is the first sanctioned city contracted, incorporated, nonprofit tiny home community built by homeless people in, they say in the world, but it's not. It was in North America. And while they started when Tent City started in 1999, and when Tent City was being evicted in 2003, I met someone who had worked on this camp. He came to help out the folks in Dignity Village, and he told me about Dignity in Exile, or about Exile. Sorry, Dignity Village. That's funny. And and while Tent City was being exiled, they were being incorporated to very divergent results. So the book, my dissertation, which I stayed at Dignity Village, used video to record interviews, about 100 hours. Invited Nigel Dixon down to take images of the people who lived there because their representation by the press was so gritty and awful and so othering. It's not the way you want to. You don't. It's not the way you want. This is what I'm trying to get across, and I know you guys know this because you seem like decent, sensitive people, but based on your facial reactions, you don't want to treat people like the other. Like that's over. We can't do that anymore. We know that we're all different. We also know that what we really want to do is bridge difference in order to bring forward positive change and supports. So Nigel's an amazing Canadian photographer. He's a member of my mother's crowd. Because I knew him, I could reach out to him. I mean, this guy, if you go to his website, nigeldixon.com, it's amazing the shots anyway, he has an amazing way of bringing out individual characters. So I brought him down and I made a film about I filmed him working with the folks having their images taken, which is not something but honestly, Dignity Village had been in about 1,000 different articles, subject of documentaries. I can't even tell you how many news stories yet. They said, Eric, if you want to write about us, you have to come live here. Nobody's lived here. And if you want to use our images, that's fine. But I said, I won't do it unless you guys have a say in it. That's literally the method that I use. It's a very reflexive form of visual ethnography. So he came. And these are some of the images he took. He asked people, and this, by the way, the one on the bottom left with the guy in his flag and the flags, none of this is staged. None of it. That's John Hawkes. He's the guy who invited me down. He was the president in 2010 when I went to visit, and he's the guy who set up my residency there for 2011. But he was doing drugs and dealing, and he got kicked out of the village because it has rules. And he was living in his van. And one of the things, and that was all the interior of his van. One of the things you find when you visit these sites of resistance, I theorize them as sites of resistance from Foucault, in the States, is that they're intense patriots. And so my thesis ended up going from saying, wow, what a wonderful place. How can we recreate this to really, what does it mean to self-govern? What does it mean for people who have traumatic histories, mental health issues, and serious addictions? What does it mean when they legally agree to self-govern in poverty? Like, isn't that raises questions that to me it's a type of structural violence, if you're familiar with that term, that really concerns me. And so I went on to write about how can we make these places better. That's what my dissertation became. But these are what the shots that Nigel took, because these are people's homes. This is what having shots taken in front of their homes, and they did dozens of shots. And the video of him working with them to decide which shots and what made them feel like they were best represented was really amazing to me. And so we wrote about that in the book Dignity in Exile as well. So it's kind of neat. This is part of the ethical part of, even with the most potentially harmful visual work, is the most potentially harmful way because there's no way to protect a person's identity. But if you give person authorship over that identity, especially in lived experience research, it's not only safer, it can be uplifting for the person who's involved. So I find that. So my dissertation ended up winning the 2014 CAGS Award for distinguished dissertation, and so They asked me to publish it, but I didn't want to publish what I had already published in the first book, which was part of the dissertation. So I rewrote a whole lot of it, and it was 5 years later. So a lot of my ideas had changed. And so one of the things that I revisited was this problem of ethical representation. So how do you present forbidden narratives without making people seem bad? How do you overcome stigma? How do you use people's stories to overcome stigma, and how do you give individuals authorship? And the work that we do today is very applied, sometimes very clinical, but we don't do, in my work, we don't do any of it without offering people who have participated a chance before we talk about it with the public or present it to government. We do it first to the people who've been involved. We have buy-in sessions basically. And also, when we do this kind of work, it's really troubling. The video of this man on the website is this is a guy who spent 2 years in a closet being abused when he was 9 years old. And he got kicked out of the village and was forced to live in this culvert. And he shares that story. And I felt really bad. I didn't know the story. He just wanted to talk. But, people get triggered when you're doing this kind of work, and you have to have safety measures in place. Now, especially when you're doing work about mental health, our work with post-secondary student homelessness the last 4 years was so triggering for students that their desperation, like setting up supports for them, has become one of the results from our study, which is just about to be released, actually. So there are things, ethical representation isn't just about how we show stories, but how do we debrief? How do we support people who are going to be triggered by talking about their experiences? And then I'm going to tell you something. After 29 years of doing this work, I come home after work teaching it, doing research, editing it, and I struggle with the ongoing pervasiveness of these issues. In fact, these issues that we're talking about have been exacerbated so vastly since COVID, especially since the housing crunch, because the loss of housing has forced people into these survival anxieties and encampments all over the world. But all in St. John, there's a new encampment almost every 3 or 4 days. So we as researchers working with lived experience it's really hard. Entering the field is sometimes easier than exiting the field or the research. So that's something that I talk about in this book. So I always try to honor, uh, like I said, lived experience. And in this work we did on the housing unit takeovers, which you may have heard about. And it's when predators take over vulnerable people's housing. We actually include all of us on this project had lived experience, mental health diagnoses, drug diagnoses, and had been homeless. This is done. The Dream Team was the organization that got funding from the city, and they hired me as the research lead. And we all had experiences of housing unit takeovers. I had two of them when I was using. When the dealers that I owed money to took over my units. This is a huge problem in Canada. The city of Toronto, like I said, just redid the study. And I'm actually there's a book coming out from England. I'm writing the intro to it as we talk. And we're going to try and do it here in the Maritimes. This is a really big issue. So and if you look at Crime Prevention Ottawa, they did a number of videos on this issue in 2013. That was the only work done in Canada besides what we did in 2017. If you look at the videos, they're designed to help people who have psychiatric vulnerabilities and addictions know when they're in the throes of a housing unit takeover. And there's a series of different response videos. So it's really important that we understand that we can house people, especially people with mental health and substance use disorders. Some of them are going to address it. They don't have to. But if they don't, and also they're almost always in a lower economic status. They're also almost always have conditions that to some degree are isolating. And those two factors contribute to their vulnerability for a unit takeover. So it's really important when we're talking to people doing this research, people who are experiencing this, to use people with that same lived experience to have those conversations. So peer support is, as we all know, very important now, especially amongst youth. Every one of us was a peer, and the study we're going to do here will also have peers. So it's very important in doing lived experience research. Another project I did was with Jesse Thistle and a bunch of other interesting scholars, which was on what they did was they talked to, I can't remember how many, but a couple of hundred elders and individuals and medical providers who work with Indigenous peoples. And they found that the Western approach to dealing with Indigenous homeless people who had medical needs was far off. So they actually devised guidelines. It was published in the Canadian Journal of Medicine, or CMA journal. They came up with specific guidelines, very much like Jesse's work on Indigenous homelessness, understanding that the way to talk to a person of Indigenous cultures or from Indigenous cultures isn't the same way. And the way you not only is there a diagnostic difference, but when people talk about spirit dreams and other things, that these are not, you as a physician may think of these things as unreal, but to individuals from that culture, these things are incredibly real and important. So this is another way that we were able to. This was in a more clinical way. I mean, the interviews were very personal, but the material was produced as evidence to present to clinicians. So the way the material was produced was very different. However, entirely based on a number of interviews, coded, themed, and presented to doctors providing medical services. So, the application of lived experience crosses all the different areas. This is the study that we've been doing most recently. I started in 2016, and I'm not giving you the whole study. It's amazing. I would gladly send you to our website, which is pssh.ca. There's tons of information there. Every day, at least 110,000 students in Canada are homeless. And when we say homeless, we don't mean necessarily sleeping in their cars, but there are four types of homelessness that Canada recognizes, and most of them are experiencing insecure housing, couch surfing, or moving from place to place. However, since we did the surveys, and it was done by Util in Quebec. They took some of our survey questions and built it into their own survey questions. So it's not based on a few hundred responses. They got close to 20,000 responses from across Canada. The mental health of students is at its mental health concerns are at their highest that we know of since we started studying it. In some cases and in some age groups, it's as high as 79%. That's a number that reflects the number of students who have been diagnosed or are seeking a diagnosis for mental health issues. We don't know the number of students who have sought accommodation for mental health issues. We should have asked that, and we didn't. So mental health is a huge issue, not only for students who are homeless, but for students in general. But when you add the housing piece, the movement, so there's this liminality that occurs when if they don't have the space, they move into other resilience patterns and they might engage in dangerous relationships. And that was very common, or stay in abusive relationships or get involved in the drug culture. And then there's the very nature of survival itself. They're staying in school. This is the message. Everyone that we talked to was in school when we talked to them. So they're staying in school despite all this hardship. And so the mental health of students in general, but students experiencing precarity is at its highest. And these are all youth 17 to 25 that we studied. So it's a major issue. And one of the recommendations that we've made for universities and colleges is not just providing housing, but even before the housing, they need basically precarity support workers. We just don't have them, especially small campuses. And in the report that we're writing now on HUTS and the one that I'm writing up now for post-secondary student homelessness is the idea of a vulnerability assessment tool. I think you guys know what VATs are. A vulnerability assessment tool is used especially amongst chronic homeless people to determine if they get housing, what is the likelihood of it happening again, and how can they prevent that. So I feel the same thing about housing unit takeovers and the same thing about students understanding their vulnerabilities. And it's not to condemn them, it's to help them, it's to give them a tool. In fact, you guys, Douglas actually created a tool very much like that for the Chez Soi at Home project, which I was part of. And that actually is one of the best studies to show that when you give people housing with supports, even people with the most severe lived experience of psychiatric issues and addictions and homelessness, so they were the highest acuity individuals we can think of, that housing was incredibly successful in the presence of supports. So that's important. Actually, I should have mentioned that to you guys. I'm sure all the records are there because Douglas was in charge of it. Dr. Latimer was. So our study was supported because we'd heard stories. I'm not going to go into too much detail. I would encourage you to go to this website. It has videos. It has all the information we have up to date. The new report will be finished shortly. The last thing I want to talk about is um, the way I use lived experience academically, right? So there's this debate in sociology and about structures versus agency, right? And there's this debate about the mind and the body. There are all these debates, all these binaries. Everything is like the different schools tend to place themselves on either side of these concepts, right? Um, when I find that everything's actually really messy. Like when you actually look at it, you can't explain something because structures are overpowering and individuals don't have any agency. You can look at, for example, and I'm going to give you the example right now. We just finished a study called the New Brunswick Housing Project. And in it, we took individuals who are living homeless and go to hospital and are released after surgery into homelessness and die, or get sick again and have to come back. And we looked at the cost of it. And so we interviewed like 50 individuals who are living in that type of lifestyle to find out what the barriers are, what their experience is like. And then we talked to the administrators, doctors, nurses, and hospital staff. And they all want to make the situation better. So we used their lived experience, collated it, came up with numbers that policymakers couldn't ignore. The cost of each one of those individuals going to hospital over 5 years was over $650,000 in cost. So this year the government said, okay, and they gave us 16 beds. They're building a new building for convalescent care for individuals with that lived experience. So it's a very good example. I wasn't able to show you it here because we're just finishing the report, but it's a very good example of how lived experience can be converted into concrete, efficacious change. And really, that's all I wanted to share with you guys today. I made a little summary, this is what lived experience is to me. I can make this available to you if you want, but I hope that in some way helps you get a sense of what I do.
Great. Thank you so much, Eric, for sharing your story and sharing all the work that's been done. So thanks so much.